There are a few things that every small town eventually discovers about itself. Sometimes it's a secret mine nobody thought to mention for 100 years, the kind of thing that makes you say, well, geez, that seems like something we should have talked about sooner. Sometimes it's a fire everyone swears wasn't that bad, even though half the town burned down and Gladys McBean quickly rebuilt it like nothing ever happened. And sometimes if you dig far enough into the archives, read enough old newspapers, or let a museum volunteer slide a yellow binder across the table with a polite smile that says, you're going to like this one. So you discover that your quiet, friendly railroad town once had, wait for it, its own standing army. So now before everyone gets excited and starts humming patriotic music, or imagines Lincoln as some kind of frontier fortress with cannons and corners and flags snapping in the breeze, before we imagine the Confederacy, an army that we beat the snot out of and then bizarrely allowed to stick around and whine about it, let's set the expectations early so nobody's confused, right? So this was not Gettysburg. This was not a band of hardened warfighters staring down the Confederate army with steel resolve and dramatic lighting. And it was definitely not aggressively intimidating, right? But for 4 solid years, from 1862 to 1866, the cadence of military commands echoed through downtown Lincoln. Boots stomped dust into the streets, muskets were shouldered, orders were issued with the kind of seriousness normally reserved for very important things. And a small group of local men with deeply reassuring confidence of people who had no idea if or when they might ever be needed. But they were very committed to being ready, right? And that right there, confident, armed, trained, local folks standing by, always being ready to protect us when called upon. It's kind of the most Lincoln thing imaginable, really. So anyway, if you stood at the corner of 5th and G Street sometimes during the Civil War, you would have heard a soundscape that feels almost impossible to picture today. No traffic noise, no leaf blowers, no delivery trucks backing up and beeping at you. Instead, the hiss of steam engines pulling into town, the clatter of wagons rattling over unpaved roads, the rumble of stagecoaches heading out towards the foothills, and layered over it all, a drill sergeant's voice, right? Loud, sharp, certain. The kind of voice that suggests the fate of the Republic itself might hinge on whether or not everyone steps off on the correct foot. So now, this wasn't Lincoln we usually picture when we tell its story, right? This isn't Pottery Works Lincoln. This isn't friendly railroad stop Lincoln. This isn't even dusty little gold country town Lincoln, right? But there it was, buried in museum files. Reference to a local militia unit, organized, armed, drilled, and officially recognized by the state of California. They called it the Lincoln and Virginia Unit, okay? The Lincoln and Virginia Union Guard. And yes, the Virginia town in Lincoln, not that other Virginia. No Confederates hiding in the hills, so no dramatic irony intended. It was just a small mining camp town, 3 or 4 miles east of Old Town Lincoln. So no relation to the state of Virginia. Truly an unfortunate name choice in retrospect, but that happens a lot in history. So officially this group was known as Company D, 1st Battalion of Infantry, 4th Brigade, National Guard of California, which sounds extremely impressive right up until you learn that it consisted of 33 men who were issued 40 muskets, had no uniforms to start with, and carried just enough authority to feel important without responsibility to cause real damage. So now, before we go any further, we want to draw a very important historical line, okay? Because California in the mid-1800s had 2 very different types of armed groups called militias. And confusing them causes no end of trouble, right? Then and now. On one side, you had the state militia. These groups were legally organized, authorized by the legislature, answerable to elected officials, and most importantly, a well-regulated militia as defined and protected by the Second Amendment. So they had paperwork, they had oversight, they had rules, they answered to someone other than themselves. On the other side, you had groups of angry, paranoid miners with muskets. They met in saloons. They elected themselves officers. They use words like militia the same way modern people use words like research. So these guys absolutely existed. They always exist, even today. They were loud, they were dramatic, they were absolutely convinced they were very, very important. Um, don't confuse our militia with terrorists, right? Those were not what Lincoln had protecting us back then. Just the opposite, in fact. Ours were completely legit. So, and the museum article is refreshingly clear about that, actually. Lincoln's militia was state organized, state authorized, and perhaps most importantly, state accountable. So by the time Lincoln formed its company in May of 1862, the Civil War was already tearing the country apart back east. And while California wasn't sending masses of troops to Gettysburg, make no mistake about it, right? The state was strategically vital to the Union. California, we did many things, right? We supplied enormous amounts of gold, controlled Pacific ports, guarded Western railroads and supply routes, and prevented Confederate influence from taking hold out here. So, and this really matters because wars aren't just won on battlefields, right? They're won by keeping things from falling apart. And if California had slipped politically, economically, logistically, the entire war changes, right? So the state legislature, they just didn't mess around. So as early as 1854, California established a formal militia system. By 1855, the state was divided into 6 military divisions and 12 brigades. Placer County sat squarely in the 4th Division, gold country, transportation country, and very much let's not let this thing go sideways country. So Placer County had been dabbling in armed organizations since practically the moment gold was discovered. As early as 1849, you see groups like the California Blades near what would later become Colfax. They were formed to deal with robbers, conflicts with native tribes, and the general chaos that followed gold like a shadow. Then came the Miners' Guards, the Placer Rifles, and a rotating cast of creatively named outfits whose uniforms ranged from matching hats to optimistic bandanas, right? Some were official, some were, aspirational. But by the time the Civil War hit, Placer County already knew how to organize men with weapons. The difference now was oversight, right? And that, my friends, is what separates prepared from problematic, okay? So in 1861, the headquarters of California's 4th Regiment was established in Auburn at a site known as Camp Siegel. This was the real thing, right? Companies drilled there. Men were sent north, men were sent east, and some were sent to miserable half-map territories, guarding forts most Americans couldn't even pronounce. So men died, not always in glorious battle, but from disease, exposure, and even assassination. This was real military service, don't get me wrong, man. And Lincoln's Company D never left town, though. Right? Which might sound unimpressive, but, until you remember what their actual job was. So, Lincoln's militia was formed just 6 months after the railroad began regular runs between Lincoln and Sacramento. And that timing really matters, right? So, railroads were lifelines, and, sabotage, unrest, political instability could have caused very real problems. So, Lincoln sat at a crossroad of transportation, communication, gold country movement. Company B's job wasn't to march east, it was to make sure nothing stupid happened here and report anything that may have. So, and for 4 years, nothing did, right? Which frankly is the highest compliment you can give a militia. So let's talk about the men, the muskets, and the black pants. So the original unit consisted of 33 men, issued 40 muskets, and absolutely no uniforms. Which means if you watch them drill, you probably saw one guy in work boots, one guy in suspenders that clearly seen some things, right? One guy who definitely forgot it was drill night. And at least one man who treated the entire affair like community theater. So, we all have that. Anyways, they had officers, captains, lieutenants, through early names, that weren't familiar with Lincoln pioneers. So in 1864, the unit was briefly disbanded for reasons nobody bothered to write down. So, which feels extremely on brand for the 1860s, right? So, they reformed with officers locally actually recognized, and at that point it officially became our little army, so let's be honest, right? For the citizens of Lincoln, militia drill night was cheap entertainment. This was before movies and before the radio and before cable news yelling at you about things you can't do a damn thing about. You watch your neighbors march around, shout commands, occasionally mess up, and take it all very seriously. So historian Winfield Davis, right, who was a boy at the time, summed it up quite perfectly, right? While there was nothing formidable about it, there was a general feeling that our local standing army, the country was safe, right? And that may be the politest burn in recorded history. So here's the part that sometimes skips, that history sometimes skips, right? California helped win the Civil War, right? Not with massive battlefield charges, but with gold, logistics, stability, and prevention, right? So the war isn't just fought with rifles, it was fought with organization. And Lincoln's little army, goofy, earnest, and dusty, was part of that system. So on July 34th, 1866, Lincoln's militia was officially mustered out. The war was over, the Union was preserved, the railroad was still running, the town was still standing. Lincoln lost one of its cheapest forms of entertainment, though, unfortunately, but, it kept something better, right? A quiet proof that when history called, even faintly, the town answered. Not loudly, not dramatically, but competently, okay? So Lincoln had, soldiers before and since, from Camp Far West pioneers to field military activity today. But the Lincoln and Virginia Unit Guard was different. It wasn't heroic in the usual way, right? It was local, earnest, slightly awkward, and had absolutely convinced, and they were absolutely convinced it was doing something important, which in its own Lincoln sort of way it was, right? So reality check, all right? Before we let our imaginations run off and start picturing Lincoln as some sort of Wild West fortress bristling with muskets, let's slow down for a minute, right? Let's sort out what's real and what's misunderstood and what's just our brains having a little too much fun with the word militia. So, because yes, Lincoln really did have a military unit, right? But no, it wasn't anything like the movies train us to expect. But that's the kind of charm, I suppose. First thing first, this part is real, right? So this wasn't a tall tale, it wasn't a rumor that grew legs over the years, and it definitely wasn't a bunch of guys who met in the back room and voted themselves officers and immediately started taking things way too seriously. The Lincoln and Virginia Union Guard was real, okay? It was created by the state of California, part of the National Guard of California, properly listed, armed, and drilled, and formed right in the middle of the Civil War. Right? This wasn't pretend, it wasn't paperwork. I mean, there was paperwork, there were orders, there was structure, okay? So when we say Lincoln had its own little army, we're not being cute. It really did. Now for the question everyone always usually asks, did they fight, right? And the short answer is nope. No. The long answer, still no, but that's not a knock, right? Lincoln's militia never marched east. They never fought Confederate troops. They never charged into battle. They defended the town from invasion. They didn't, they did if it would have happened, but, and they didn't have a single big dramatic moment, right? They never fired a shot in anger. And that's okay, right? Because that was never their job to begin with. So what was their job? So here's the part that gets missed when we talk about Civil War, like it was all smoke cannons and stirring speeches, right? Wars weren't just won on battlefields. They're won with organization, and California was supplying massive amounts of gold to the Union. Massive is an understatement, really. I mean, they were guarding posts, railroads, supply routes, keeping the western states stable, and bringing up federal troops to fight back east. So state militias existed so the Union didn't have to worry about California unraveling while the rest of the country was on fire. Lincoln's militia was part of a safety net, right? They were there so nothing bad happened. And since, nothing bad did happen, mission accomplished, right? So, a quick but important note about militias, okay? And this part really does matter because not all militias are the same. In 1800s, California, there were two very different kinds, right? One was state organized, government authorized, accountable, structured, and most importantly protected by the Second Amendment, right? The other kind was groups of angry, rude, paranoid men with guns and opinions. Paso County had both at various points, right? Lincoln's unit was firmly in the first category. They weren't vigilantes, they weren't self-appointed. They weren't making political statements, right? They were delightfully boring. And boring's good. So even people who lived at the time admitted that they had, 33 men, 40 muskets, no uniforms, drill nights, doubled with public entertainment. So historian Winfield Davis, who watched them, as a boy, politely noted that there was nothing formidable about them, which is historians speak for, they tried really hard. But, here's the thing, right? You don't measure militia by how scary it looks. You measure it by whether people feel safe, okay? And people did, all right? So here's the big picture about California and the Civil War, right? Because this part deserves more credit than it usually gets. California absolutely helped the Civil War. We paid a heavy price for it, too. Not with giant battlefield charges, but with fortune gold, logistics, and national stability. If California wobbled, the Union would have had a real problem, right? We fed them, we dressed them, we paid the bills, we protected our western lands. Lincoln's little army was one, small thread in that whole larger fabric, right? It wasn't flashy, no dramatic, but it was very necessary. So, the Confederacy seceded, fought, lost to America, and then spent the next 160 years insisting it was actually a win because we let the losers stick around town. So Lincoln's own little army wasn't about violence, right? It was about defense. It was about showing up, being prepared, taking responsibility seriously, and stepping aside when the job was done. They drilled, they marched, they stood ready. And when the war ended, they went home. No legends, no statues, no dramatic last stand, just a small town quietly doing its part in dusty boots, borrowed muskets, and a whole lot of earnest effort. So, and that feels exactly right for Lincoln. So, before we wrap up, I want to give a huge shout out to the Lincoln Area Archives Museum. These incredible folks keep our town's history alive. Every map, every newspaper, every folder packed with stories just like this one. If you've never been in, you're missing out. So thanks for watching another Strange Stories of Lincoln. Keep your eye out for the next episode. If you like this one, share it on YouTube with someone who cares about our town or simply likes storytelling. Once again, I'm Mike Crossfield, local business owner trying to build a better Lincoln together. Thank you. Good night.